basically 50-50% of this integration and basically putting its house in order. Libya, remember Libya, Gaddafi, and the hopes for Libya. Libya is in work in progress. It could go either way. Somalian way, or basically a relatively transparent, pluralistic way. Bahrain, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, the entire region is in turmoil. So why do I belittle the notion that the Arab Spring is over? And here I want to, just for you students to realize that we as social scientists and historians, we don't focus on the moment. We do not focus on the headlines. We do not focus on the instant, basically, results of any particular great historical events. It's essential for us to focus on patterns, on trends, on conceptual keys, on comparative systems that help us understand what's happening in the region. And that's exactly what I want to do today. I want to focus on certain comparative historical patterns and keys that help us understand the turmoil in the region and why what's happening in the region, this is part of a great historical revolutionary moment that will unfold over many years, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, probably 30 years, probably 40 years, and we don't know. We're not equipped to tell how long this particular historical process will unfold. Just to give you an idea when I say comparative terms, think of what it has taken Eastern Europe since the 1980s, collapse of the Soviet Union and the Berlin Wall. Eastern Europe is still unfolding. It has not reached the safe harbor of democracy. It's still work in progress. Latin America, the 1990s, still unfolding. These historical moments take time because institutional building, block by block from the bottom up, takes time. Why am I talking about Eastern Europe and Latin America? Let's look at the Westphalian system. Some of you who study international relations. The Westphalian system, 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, the birth of the nation state. This is Western Europe. Look how long it took Western Europe to reach the safe harbor of democracy. 1648, 1945. 300 years. 300 years for the Western European system to basically consolidate and reach a kind of a relative democratic system. And think what transpired in those 300 years between 1648 and 1945. I don't need to remind you that the great, developments, one of the greatest probably crimes in world history, 1930s and early 1940s, that is the Holocaust. We reached this particular safe harbor after many years and many developments, not to mention the religious wars and what have you. Just to give you an idea how regions of the world and civilizations of the world travel a similar journey, of course less violent journey than the Westphalian system that basically we know very well in Europe itself. So what's happening in this part of the world? Why the turmoil continues and why the turmoil will continue for the next 1 or 2 or 3 decades. 4 or 5 conceptual keys and quickly, and remember please, I'm simplifying a great deal. And I hope during the question and answer, I'll try to answer any of the questions that you have. The first point I want to put on the table today is that what has happened in this part we call the modern Middle East, or the Arab Middle East, is what I call a psychological rupture. A psychological rupture has taken place in this part of the world. The old authoritarian system, remember what existed in the modern Middle East after the exit of colonialism from the region at the end of World War II and the late 1940s, basically the post-colonial state that replaced colonialism after the end of World War II was an authoritarian system, autocratic system based on the domination of the military. The man on the horseback has been the dominant political system in that part of the world from the late 1940s up to the present. I mean, think when we think of the Middle East. Syria, the Assad family has been in power for more than 40 years. Gaddafi of Libya, 42 years. The presidents of Yemen, Ali Abdullah Saleh, 39 years. Mubarak of Egypt, 1980, 81, 2012. This is what you're talking about. You're talking about, I mean, dictators who promised heaven initially before, after the exit of colonialism, and of course, what did they deliver? They delivered dust. They did not deliver democracy. They did not deliver bread. They did not deliver transparency. So what has happened in the last 3 years is a psychological rupture. People now feel empowered. They feel that they have really, agency is back. In this particular sense, you have a great deal of empowerment from the bottom up, because the system that was in place for 40, 50 years is no longer. And you have people now basically calling, whether you're talking about Syrians or Egyptians or Yemenis or even Iranians and others, they're calling for what are the three terms, what are the rallying cries of the large popular uprisings. Remember, all of you, it's al-hurriya and al-karama and al-adal, the three terms, the millions of people. And al-hurriya is freedom, al-karama is dignity, and al-adala is justice. People would like to live in dignity. They want justice and they want liberty. These were the three major aspirations and rallying cry of millions of people. And really, if we summarize the three rallying cries, they can simply be summarized as effective citizenship. They want to be dignified citizenship. They want to live in dignity, they were not living in dignity for many years, because we know what the dictators did over many years. So in this particular sense, the point for us, we students, I mean, how do you deliver social justice? How do you deliver employment and jobs? How do you deliver democracy? How do you deliver dignity in systems that have been turned upside down in the last 3 years? What will it take? How long will it take? And I'll come back to explain to you why these terms that can be translated in effective citizenship will take many years to be realized, to be delivered, if ever, in that part of the world. The second point I want to put on the table for you to think about, why what's happening, what's unfolding in the region is historical and complex and will take many years, is that we should not be surprised. Because what has happened, as I mentioned earlier, really can be compared to great historical moments. You cannot understand what's happening in this part of the world, called the modern Middle East, except by understanding what happened in the aftermath of the French Revolution, in the Russian revolutions, in the Iranian revolutions. Great historical moments, and what happens, and you know what happens in the aftermath of great revolutions. You know the multiple faces, the many faces of revolutions. You can read Shakespeare, and he tells you a great deal about what happens in the aftermath of revolutions. What I'm trying to say to you, students of humanities and economics and the social sciences, the old hegemony is over. What do I mean by hegemony? The domination of the dictators, of the man on the horseback, is gone. And there's no new hegemony that has replaced the old order. No new legitimacy. The system is a huge deal of vacuum of authorities. Because the old system has collapsed. And the new system is being basically, people, groups, social movements are basically fighting in order to bring about a new system. So what you have is a huge vacuum of authority. What you have is a huge vacuum of hegemony. And unless, what I'm trying to say to you, unless institutions are put in place block by block, the fights will continue. The struggles will continue, the social struggles between the various social and political forces what I'm trying to say to you, unless the institutional framework is established in that part of the world, you're going to have great social and economic and political struggles. In the same way to what has happened in great historical moments, whether we're talking about Russia or America or England and what have you. And here, what makes this particular struggle so fierce is that there is no great idea, there is no great overarching idea to replace the old discredited idea of the man on the horseback, of somehow the Arab nationalism or Islamism. This idea, what we call, let's say, we call it here what? Democracy, pluralism, parliamentary democracy. So far in that part of the world, the struggles in Egypt, in Iran, in Syria, in Libya is about what kind of what's the identity of the state? What kind of a system we would like to establish? What's the role of the sacred in the political process? How much Islam shall we have in the system? How much secularism? And thus what I'm trying to say is that when you hear people in Tunisia and Libya fighting over the constitution, it's not about the document, it's about the identity of the state. What kind of a state we would like to have? How parliamentarian, how pluralistic, how religious? These are the debates that are taking place. In Eastern Europe, in the 1980s and 1990s, they knew exactly where they wanted to go, right? Where did Eastern Europe want to go? They wanted to be part of the European family. No identity crisis. Eastern Europe knew exactly where it wanted to go. It had a compass, and the compass, it wanted to be part of the European family. Latin America wanted to establish relatively democratic societies along, what we call separations of power. In this part of the world, we call the modern Middle East, there is no such compass. There's a great deal of chaos. There's a great deal of dust. And thus, unless these debates are resolved, unless the identity of the state is basically, people sit down and agree on it, you're going to have major, fierce, very violent struggles. Even though I would argue, and this is on the positive side, I think more and more people in that part of the world are coming to say constitutionalism is the way to go. I think, and I could be wrong, what's emerging now, whether you're talking about Egypt or Libya or Tunisia, more and more Middle Easterners, more and more Arabs and Muslims are coming to say constitutionalism is the way forward. And I think we are seeing the beginning of a consensus in that part of the world, but it's still too early that this particular struggle has not been resolved. It has to be resolved for this vacuum of authority, of hegemony, of legitimacy to basically be settled in that part of the world. The third point I want to make, and just to give you an idea why we should not be surprised by the turmoil, by the great struggles that are taking place in that part of the world. I've been talking so far about the structural political crisis, about the lack of what we call consolidated institutions. What you have in that part of the world are fragile institutions, because the cult of personality replaced institutions. You have dictators, whether you're talking about the Egyptian president, late President Nasser, or Gaddafi of Libya, or Mubarak of Egypt, or Saleh of the cult of personality itself became the dominant feature of Middle Eastern politics, as opposed to institutions, where you have parliaments, you have the judiciary, you have the president, and you have, of course, the electoral box determines the nature of the political system. But this structural political crisis cannot be understood without understanding the structural, social, and economic crisis. In fact, I would argue everything I've said, the most important, the most existential crisis in the region is social and economic. What do I mean by that? And here I don't have the time to really flesh out and lay on the table for you the extent of the structural economic crisis. I mean, think what I started my talk by saying this particular part of the world has more than 2/3 petroleum resources in the world. 320 million people probably have the largest part of black gold in history. The Middle East itself, what we call the modern Middle East, should have been the Norway of the world. I mean, I cannot tell you how much resources there are in terms of raw resources, human resources, and also the ability in terms of agriculture. And 320 million people, you're talking about 600 billion barrels of oil. Iran, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, the biggest gas, reserves in the world. The world economy, and I mean it, the world economy runs on inexpensive oil and gas from that part of the world. Everything you have here comes from that part of the world. The tables, the chairs, the clothes, the gas and oil, literally everything. Truly, the pain, literally, so far, of course, there are new resources being discovered in North America and other places, but everything that we in this room here literally comes from that part of the world. 320 million people. If you go to Knightsbridge and see how the Saudis, you think this is that's what everyone in that part of the world should be like. Billionaires with sports car and expensive mansions in London and Las Vegas and Paris, right? Out of the 320 million people who live in that part of the world, we estimate that 43.9% live either in poverty or below the poverty line. 43.9% of the 320 million people live in poverty or below the poverty line on less than $2 a day. Egypt, 90 million people. Just to give you an idea what Egypt was in 1950. Egypt, the median income in Egypt was ahead of South Korea and Japan in 1950. Just immediately after Great Britain left Egypt. That is, Egypt should have been the Japan of the Middle East. You have 40 million Egyptians who live either in poverty or below the poverty line. Lebanon, 40%. Yemen, 60%. Sudan, 70%. Gaza, 80%. In Saudi Arabia, how many of you know that there are 5 million people in Saudi Arabia who live either in poverty or below the poverty line? Saudi Arabia, the wealthiest nations in the world. These are, just give you an idea when you think of the turmoil, the social turmoil. The Arab world, when we say the Arab Middle East, this is one of the wealthiest regions in the world, is unemployment among the youth. More than 30% unemployment among young people. Educated people, over 50% in Tunisia, in Algeria. And so you can imagine when you say young people, when you say 30% unemployment. In terms of, this part of the world is supposed to be the Norway of Europe. In terms of, security, food insecurity, the most insecure regions in the world in terms of food insecurity, it cannot feed itself. Sudan should be the breadbasket of the entire Arab and North Africa, theoretically. The least secure, it's not one, the least secure regions in terms of food. It basically imports between 80 and 90% of its grain. It lives actually on wheats in Utah and Australia and French, Egypt and the rest, including Sudan itself. This part of the world tops the world in terms of income inequality. We think of London and the United States in terms of concentration. This part of the world tops the world. It's not one of the regions in terms of income inequality. So the people who drive their sports car in Knightsbridge, you go to Saudi Arabia and see when floods happen in Riyadh and talk to these people. Just to give you an idea, when you hear the turmoil and the struggles and the tensions in the region. And given all that, we estimate in terms of demography that between 60 and 70% of the people in that part of the world, the 320 million people, are below the ages of 28 years old. So when I say to you that unemployment unemployment among the youth is between 30 and 50%, including the you're talking about huge constituency. Huge constituency. How do you feed, how do you educate in Egypt where you have almost 100 million people and a country that does not produce anything anymore? Institutions are very fragile. This country that was almost, ahead of Japan and South Korea in the 1950s, look what the bloody dictators have done. This is not a question of culture or anything, it's a question of governance, governance, governance. We have to understand what has happened between the 1950s and the present to understand why, how, if just to give you an idea, clear idea for you students to understand, there are many wealthy people in that part of the world because there's tons of raw resources, but the entire populations have been pauperized, literally, systematically pauperized over the last 40 years. As a result, in fact, some of you might find this, the Middle East today now is below Africa in terms of economic and social measures. That's how, so you have the Middle East, the Arab world, and other regions of the world. Yet, think of, what it means. And at the same time, I want you to combine this, go back to my point about the question of empowerment, about the question of the psychological rupture. So you have people now who feel empowered. The role of agency. They realize, you have systemic corruptions. When I talk the concentration of wealth, where's all the money? I just want you to imagine. It's again in terms of the corruption. One of the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, tops the world in terms. Corruption is not about 10% or 20%. It's systemic. So how do you go from here? How do you? What I'm trying to say to you, how do you build? When I say building institutions, about not just that voting today in Libya for the Constitutional Assembly. How do you, set up? How do you rebuild the institutions? And you know what institutional building. If you have the time to read a great book by Ralph Dahrendorf. Dahrendorf was the master at the London School of Economics and St. Antony's College. His book on political theory. Dahrendorf, as one of the leading political theorists, estimate that on the whole, institutional building takes between 40 and 80 years, 4080. Give and take about 50 years to build not only institutions, but you have to consolidate the institutions. Think of what it takes. Of course, the process itself can be expedited, but think what we're talking about in terms of challenges. Quickly, so what else? What's happening in the region? Just to give you an idea, I want to put 2 or 3 more points before I conclude. I want to open for questions. On top of all that, what you have now is what I call a fierce geostrategic struggle taking place. In the new geostrategic struggle in the Middle East is between Iran on the one hand and Saudi Arabia on the other hand. You've heard, I'm sure you read the newspapers on a daily basis. In the Middle East itself, in the greater Middle East, the new fierce struggle is between Shia-dominated Iran and Sunni-dominated Saudi Arabia. Some of you students, Islam and Islam, there are 2 basically sets of Muslims. You have Sunni Muslims and you have Shiite Muslims. Shiite Muslims are a minority. They represent between 9 and 12% of Muslims. So Sunnis represents about 90%, give and take. But please, for you, some of you, when you think of Shiites and Sunnis, don't think of the same divide in Christianity between Protestants and Catholics. In Christianity, there is a doctrinal difference. You all remember the Protestant Revolution. There is a philosophical divide between Protestants and Catholics. In Islam, when you say Sunnis and Shiites, there is no such doctrinal difference. Right? Because in Islam, if you're a Muslim, you're a Muslim. But this particular, so you might say, what are you talking about? What's this conflict between Sunnis and Shiites? The difference basically stemmed from the clash after Prophet Muhammad's death over who should succeed the Prophet. So the community divided along 2 lines. A minority of Muslims said the closest member of his family should succeed the Prophet. But the majority of the community said No, the most effective and the most representative and the most skilled and qualified should be elected by the community, by the shura, consultation. So the community divided along whether the descendant, the closest descendants of the prophets should succeed Muhammad, and huge battle ended with the, of course, brutal butchering of the close family of the Prophet. And that was Ali and Hussein, as you know, this great clash in Islam. And that particular divide over personalities. So the divide in Islam is over personalities as opposed to doctrinal, philosophical differences. But yes, over the years, 1400 centuries, it has been invested with great ideological and great civilizational meanings. And now, I mean, this particular struggle between Saudi Arabia, when I say to you Saudi Arabia has a great deal of symbolism and resonance. It's where Muhammad was born. It's the place where Mecca and Medina, the two greatest, holy places in Islam. And Iran is the most important Shiite state in the Muslim world. This particular clash between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf is not really about religion. It's about domination in the Gulf. Who should dominate the Persian Gulf? Or the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, depending on how you call it. And when we say this is not a very theoretical question, it's about resources. It's about gas, it's about oil, it's about waterways. This is where the money is, where the resources are. But you see what has happened as a result of this particular clash. It has been invested with a thick layer of sectarianism. So now, Saudi Arabia and Iran, followers and supporters of Iran and Saudi Arabia, are waging civil wars against one another. And where is the civil war taking place? Where do you think the civil war taking place? Syria. So Syria, I started my talk by saying a large popular uprising in the rest of the region, including Syria. But what has happened in Syria in the last 2 years, is basically now multiple conflicts collapse in one. And now Syria has descended into all-out civil war. So it's between the Sunnis, who are a majority in Syria. The Sunnis in Syria represent about 70%, and the Alawites, the Shiites, represent about 15%. So this conflict inside Syria now has taken on sectarian meanings and connotations, and Saudi Arabia and Iran are waging wars by proxies in Syria itself. And this conflict is spreading like wildfires, spreading into Lebanon, spreading into Jordan, spreading into Iraq. It's really poisoning the veins of Middle Eastern politics. What used to be hopes and aspirations now is basically killing fields, suicide bombs, car bombs, massacres. It's a bloodbath. You watch it and you read it on a daily basis. It's truly a bloodbath. And what's more important, to come back, another point I want to highlight, is that on top of this sectarian geostrategic struggle that's taking place, you have a new jihadi current. You have a new jihadi current that has been imposed on top of this particular conflict. And this is between Al-Qaeda, right? Al-Qaeda, which is a hyper-Sunni faction, and it promotes itself, it packages itself, it's defending the Sunnis against the Shiites and against, the infidels. And Al-Qaeda now is spreading. It's spreading into Iraq, into Syria, into Jordan, into Turkey, because it is basically why? Are we surprised why Al-Qaeda is spreading? I've written a great deal on Al-Qaeda, the center. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri. But what we have now is local groups who are basically finding vacuums of authority. Al-Qaeda is a parasite. It feeds on instability and chaos. And there's a great deal of chaos and instability, right? Institutions are not in place. The security apparatus basically are fragile. You don't have any kind of hegemony established. You have civil wars. No wonder why. You have Al-Qaeda in Iraq. You have the Islamic State in Iraq. You have Al-Nusra Front. You have Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Literally, in Libya, in Yemen, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. So when you think, when you hear reports and you read, and you say, what's happening? Why Al-Qaeda? This was supposed to be a great moment of hope. Why Al-Qaeda is spreading in the region? We should not be surprised, because this transitional period, this particular moment of chaos, of instability, this moment of vacuum of authority, as long there is a vacuum, as long there is no hegemony established to replace the old hegemony, we expect all kinds of social parasites. Whether you're talking about the Assad family, whether you're talking about various Al-Qaeda and extremist groups, to basically try to fill these vacuums of authorities. They have a space. And more important than space, unfortunately, some Sunnis who feel basically threatened by Iran and by dictators like Assad, flirt with Al-Qaeda. Flirt with Al-Qaeda because they think that Al-Qaeda is the vanguard that takes on basically the minorities, regimes, and the oppressors. This is quite a very depressing picture. I punctured hole in my own argument that I started by saying we cannot talk about the end of the Arab Spring, because there was no Arab Spring. We're talking about large-scale popular uprising. My big point, what I want you to take out of my talk today, is that we're talking about a historical, sociological process. You have, the extent of the socioeconomic political crisis is very deep, and it's deepening by the day. What I'm trying to say to you is that there is no early closure. We as social scientists were not equipped to predict the future. Well, we predict the past, of course. That's all. So in this particular sense, we might be talking about 5 years, we might be talking about 10 years, we might be talking about 20 years. But what has taken place, I will argue, and this is my final point, what has taken place has turned the wheels of history in a progressive direction. I have never been as optimistic about the future of that part of the world as I am today. Despite all the chaos, despite all the dust, one thing I want you to be aware, don't be blinded by the dust. The dust, once the dust basically disappears, you're going to have systems emerging out of this particular chaos. I'm not saying we're going to have democracies, because democracies, how long they take. But most probably you're going to have more pluralistic societies where agency, where people basically have a say in their own government, as opposed to being dominated by bloody dictators like Mubarak and Al-Assad until then. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your inspiring and comprehensive lecture. Now, we can take questions from the floor. Yes, I'll take. I think you stick it up first.
Professor, in this whole context, you mentioned two very important.
Would you like to introduce yourself,
Yeah.
where you're coming from? So,
Sure.
with
My name is Mohammed Kishadji. I'm a writer on conflict resolution, particularly alternative forms of dispute resolution.
Right.
I've written a book on it, but I'm also a student of this place. You mentioned two important points. One was you showed a lot of hope, and you spoke of constitutionalism. But could you give your take on why does the present expression of grievance take the form of we want the Sharia to come back? Why is it in that particular frame? And yet, when people are asking for things, they're asking for social justice, they're asking for transparency, they're asking for... Well, how do you reconcile the two?
Well, first of all, what we need to understand, there's a huge difference when you say, I use the term, the role of the sacred in the political process. I think I would say, if you look at Europe itself in the early part of the 20th century, the Christian Democrats and what have you, there was a great deal of debate in Europe itself on the role of the sacred in the political process. This does not mean that these people are calling for a measure of religion, of identity. When we say really Islam, we're talking about identity. Does does not mean they want to establish Islamic states. It means they want to take religion and they take it very seriously. And let me here zero in on a question, on the big point of your question. When the Arab uprisings, erupted, the dominant wisdom in the field, in international relations, was that the Islamists were coming. The Islamists would take ownership of the so-called Arab Spring. Remember? The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Renaissance Party in Tunisia, the Justice Party in Morocco, the AKP in Turkey. The dominant wisdom was that the Islamists, whether you're talking about mainstream Islamists or radical, would basically take ownership of the moment. This is 2 years ago. What has happened to the Islamists in the last 1 year? Can anyone tell me what happened to the Islamists? They have fallen like ripe fruits in almost every single country. Millions of Egyptians revolted against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt because the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt insisted on a heavy dose of Sharia in the constitution. Yes, the military came to power in Egypt because the military realized that millions of Egyptians were really terrified that the Islamists in Egypt were changing the identity of the state. You remember what I said earlier, that the big debates in the region is not about basically, the Muslim Brotherhood and General Sisi, the military man. It's about what kind of a state, the identity of the state itself. Millions, and this is true, this is not I'm not saying anything original here. Millions of Egyptians, poor Egyptians, pious Egyptians, veiled Egyptians came on the streets over 6-7 months and challenged the hegemony of the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamist Party, because the Islamist Party did not take into account that millions of Egyptians did not want the state to be dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood. They did not want an Islamic state, either a soft one or a heavy one. And of course, the military used the millions of Egyptians, climbed on the shoulders of the protest, and returned to politics. In Tunisia, you remember the Renaissance Party? They won a huge majority. Rashid Ghannouchi, the name probably does not mean anything to you. Rashid Ghannouchi lived in London here for 20 years in exile. He is the leader of the Renaissance Party in Tunisia. He's an Islamist party. And for some of you students, when we say an Islamist is a religious activist who would like to establish a state based on Islamic law. So they want to create, it's not based on democracy, it's not based on secularism, it's based on Islamic law. And most of the parties, basically their foundation, their constitution, based on an element of Sharia. So what did Ghannouchi? He thought, like the Muslim Brotherhood, he could really change the identity of the relatively secular state in Tunisia. Ghannouchi and the Islamists, who won a great majority, realized that millions of Tunisians did not vote for the Renaissance Party to establish an Islamic state. Guess what happened to the Renaissance Party? They're out of the power now. Back a coalition of secular. What I'm trying to say to you is that, yes, there is a sizable segment of people in that part of the world who still basically believe their identity is located, is based, on the sacred. That the overwhelming, and this is really a discovery for all of us, most of us thought that the Islamists, the religious activists, are the dominant basically segment in society. Far from it. In fact, the dominant majorities in that part of the world, even though they're pious, when you see them praying and veiled, does not mean they are Islamists. There's a big difference between a pious Muslim and an Islamist. And Egypt itself is a testament to the fact that while Egyptians are pious, they want their constitution to be a neutral constitution. And that's why, a constitution based on the separation of power. I'm not suggesting that they want liberal democracy. That's not what I'm saying. But they want a state based basically on transparency, on pluralism, on the separation of power. And to my mind, myself as a secularist, this is a good beginning. It's a good beginning after many, many years of cultural, political, and economic decline that what we had feared has not materialized so far.
Yes.
My name is Saad Squeezy, and I'm a British citizen with Moroccan roots. My question is really about Turkey. How do you see the chaos in the Arab Middle East affect Turkey, and what's happening in Turkey? And also, how do you see the Turkish model, the AKP model from the Ataturk model, influencing the development of the institutions in
Thank you. I mean, just the two questions are really related to one another. Because you see, Turkey is ruled by a party called the AKP party. And the prime minister name is Erdogan. And this is a form of soft Islamism. So the AKP belongs to a family of Islamism. Remember, the family of Islamism is a large family. So you have mainstream, you have radical, and you have extremist. So you have, I mean, the AKP, you have the Renaissance in Tunisia, you have the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and you have Al-Qaeda. See how large this family is? It's huge. It's a family with many faces. I mean, this is due. So Turkey, the AKP party that came to power more than 10 years ago, was seen as the model, was seen as the example everywhere. Why? Not because of its Islamism, because the AKP has managed to really bring Turkey into one of the leading emerging markets in the world. Turkey has the largest 17th economy in the world. Turkey is as powerful as Brazil and more powerful than South Africa. And this is as a result of the rise of course, changes in the country itself, but the AKP is credited with really making Turkey as a giant economic power. And in fact, in the last 10 years, people were talking in the region, in the entire Middle East, the model is Turkey, not Iran. Remember, Iran is ruled by a radical Shia Islamist system. The system in Iran is called Vilayat al-Faqih. Vilayat al-Faqih is the rulership of the cleric. That is the supreme leader who's cleric. Today's supreme leader is Ali Khamenei. He is an absolute leader in Iran. And everything, he has the final say. He is the executive leader, even though the president is elected by the people. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who's not elected, is the commander-in-chief. So it's a system based on religious authority. It is a hardcore Islamist party. Most people in that part of the world, including Shiites, don't look towards Iran as an example. They look towards Turkey, because Turkey has proven to be a successful example. Let's guess what now? Even Turkey now, the Turkish model, more and more Turks have soured on the Turkish model. Erdogan basically has been in power for too long. He has proven to be authoritarian. A great deal of tensions and protests. The protests have reached Turkey. I mean, that is how bad the Islamists suffer now, truly. I mean, the Turkish model was supposed to be the model. That's it. You have a democracy, Western-like democracy, and a Muslim state. I mean, Turkey was able to marry Western democracy with Islam. But more and more Turks now fear that Erdogan and the AKP are changing the identity of the state. They are imposing a heavy dose of ultra-conservative ideology. I'm not suggesting that these protesters represent a majority, but the AKP is no longer the model, the example in the region. In fact, it's challenged inside Turkey itself. Not on economic, even though many Turks give credit to the AKP. They believe that they fear that their personal freedoms, they believe that their constitution, they believe that their way of life is being changed inside Turkey itself. Just listen to the news on a daily basis in Turkey and see this great debate and struggle that's taking place in Turkey. And this is a testament to the fact that the Islamists, this is really one of the lowest points in the history of the Islamists. Even though the received wisdom was that the Islamists would take ownership of this particular moment and the entire region would follow the Iranian example. On the contrary, it seems to me that the Islamists really have discovered how difficult it is to impose their agenda on the people in the region.
Hi, Douglas. I'm an administrator at UAL, and a history student. I was going to ask how you think these large-scale popular uprisings in the Middle East have been affected by, and whether they've been accelerated by the internet and the use of social media, what part that has had to play in these uprisings.
broke out, there was a great deal of interest and coverage of the internet, the online, the Facebook, and yes, to a certain extent, but I can tell you from personal experience, few people in the Middle East can afford the internet. I can tell you from, when I travel in the Middle East, it takes me an hour or two to find an internet. And it's expensive. It's expensive for me, and you can imagine how expensive for the average people. It's a very tiny, small community that uses the internet. Even more people use the telephone. If you really want to understand, it's the new media. If there is, if one of you really want to do a great thesis, it's really called Al Jazeera effect. It's Al Jazeera is much more powerful than any kind of, technology online that exists in that part of the world. Why? Because Al Jazeera connects the hamlets and the towns and the villages, even the tiniest, smallest village in Libya. Let's say there's one television station. So you have the entire village community goes and watches television at night in that particular household. So, in fact, in Libya and Tunisia, they were saying, thank you, Al Jazeera. Thank you, Al Jazeera, for connecting these people together. Every time Al Jazeera, a particular program, 50, 60 million people watches Al Jazeera on average, in terms of the community. This is really the new media. Truly, you cannot understand what has happened and why the people were connected with each other in that part of the world, except by understanding the role of Al Jazeera. Unfortunately for Al Jazeera now is basically has become part of the, not only debates, but Al Jazeera is an instrument of war. It has really plunged into the various, because Al Jazeera, as you know, is owned by Qatar, and Qatar has its own foreign policy agenda. So Qatar, in many ways, has become the spearhead of basically resistance, opposition, ways to dislodge its own government. So in many ways, Al Jazeera's role has been, on the whole, I would say, positive, very progressive. Unfortunately for Al Jazeera, it has, for a variety of political reasons now, it has become an arm of certain governments. It really has lost a great deal of credibility because of its coverage and because of its siding with one particular camp against, because of the civil wars that have taken place in the region. But to answer your question directly, it was not the internet, it was really the new media, basically represented by Al Jazeera and the various television stations in the region. Because remember also, you're talking about in Egypt, 60% of the population are illiterate. So what you have is television. It's not just in America where people watch, majority of Americans take their news from television. In the Arab world, you're talking about, 70, 80%. But the people diet comes from, television stations. And this is why the new media are so important. There was a question.
Any other question? Come on, I want to see my
Please.
student. Yes.
Daud Senduga, I'm a student of UL. I'm sorry for the question I'm going to ask you covered in my absence. You talked about civil war in Syria. I would like to know where we've had civil wars in countries like Libya and Iraq. Americans have had to go and intervene. I'm wondering why they haven't taken any military step to sort of disturb it. What could be considered the factors? Why are they sort of like they are not doing what they did in Iraq, what they did in Libya? That's my question.
It's a very important question. I think it's the question of the day now. Where's America in all of this? Why the Obama administration has been reluctant to intervene inside Syria. I've written a book on this. I really hope you take a look at it. It's called Obama and the Middle East, the End of America's Moment. It's a question mark. First of all, you know as well as I do that Obama came to the White House on the platform of anti-war, the anti-Iraq war. Barack Obama was a very humble senator from a very relatively small state in the United States. And he made his really name by opposing the illegal, unjust war in Iraq itself. But he is an anti-war president, point one. Point two, Iraq, it's not just a human, catastrophe. Iraq was a great catastrophe for American foreign policy. I mean, in terms that, I mean, the United States, you know, I mean, I don't know if you know this, the United States has spent $4.9 trillion on Al-Qaeda, on the wars after 9/11. $4.9 trillion. These are not my numbers. The Brown University's economist number, a group of economists. 4.9, it's not billions. 4.9 trillions. Iraq has cost 1 trillion. 5,000 American troops killed, 49,000 injured seriously, and the Iraqis, we estimate between 200 and 1 million, give and take. We don't know the exact, the numbers are extremely, and in the eyes of the world, I mean, think of what the Iraq war has done in terms of, I mean, damage to America's standing, to America's deterrence credibility. Because you see, force, you can use force, but once you use force and it fails, it does a great deal of damage. Americans are exhausted. They're exhausted, and Barack Obama is a president who believes that the United States is overextended, has overextended itself in the Middle East. In fact, he is trying to disengage, and it's the whole idea of the pivot to the Pacific region. American policymakers now believe that America's future lies in the Pacific region, not in the Middle East itself. So the United States in the last 6 years has been slowly and gradually disengaging from the Middle East to other parts of the world. Syria, for the United States, I mean, was, you know, remember when you talk about foreign policy, and Barack Obama is a realist president. He basically views the world in terms of interests, not in terms of question of morality and question of liberalism. To him, are American interests involved in Syria? He said, I will never send American boots to any theater in the world unless American interests are involved. Syria, one of the poorest countries in the region, 25 million people, has no resources. It sits in the heart of the region. You intervene in Syria, you're going to go to war against Iran and Hezbollah. If you intervene in Syria, it means war against Iran and Hezbollah and Iran. How many of you know that the United States spent blood and fortune to liberate Iraq? Iraq now is one of the major pivotal allies of Assad. The most powerful state in Iraq today is not the United States, it's Iran. This tells you about how politics produce reverse opposite results from their intended consequence. So for a variety of reasons, Barack Obama looks at Syria and says, how can I go? How can I intervene directly? Because first of all, I am exhausted. The American economy is in a dismal shape. Americans have no stomach to intervene militarily. There is no Security Council. And going to war against Syria, that means it might escalate into a broader conflict. This does not mean that we might not see American intervention, limited military intervention. I think Obama does not have any choice now because the pressure is overwhelming, given the bloodbath inside Syria itself. I think we're seeing the Americans are beginning to rethink their strategy inside Syria. My take on it, they're already arming the opposition, and whether Obama intervenes or not, the next president, because this conflict, you know how civil wars are, this conflict, we're talking about 5-10 years. This is not about 2 or 3 years. That is minimum 5 years, if not 10-15 years. What I'm trying to suggest is that if a Republicans come to power, even if Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton wanted to go, as you know, when she was Secretary of State. So you might see limited American intervention indirectly, as opposed to putting troops in the next 2 years or so, in particular after the end of the Obama administration. Yeah,
can I just follow up a bit on that? So this shift of your strategy from Europe, Middle East to the Pacific theater, is it because of the rise of China?
Well, it's for a variety of reasons. I mean, if you look at economic indicators now, and I'm not an economist, the consensus in the American foreign policy elite, and this is part of the open record now, that the big economic giants are in the Pacific region. So you're talking about Australia, you're talking about China, you're talking about Japan, you're talking about South Korea, This is where the big money is. This is where the investment. And if you look at also how the American naval forces, even the American naval forces, the administration is, shifting its strategic posture. So economically and militarily, and the Americans would like to counterbalance China as well. Because the South Korean and the Japanese, and they're terrified that China is rising. And China is developing a major muscular foreign policy, as you know, just read the news on a daily basis. So the Americans economically and strategically are basically pivoting. It's called a pivot to Asia. This is now part of the national security architecture in the United States. And Obama and the foreign policy elite believe that the previous administrations basically overextended America's influence in the Middle East far and beyond what America's national security requirements deserve. And that's why it does not mean that the Gulf is not important. The Gulf is important. That's why I would say Iran's nuclear portfolio is one of the most important theaters for the administration now. And that's why the focus on Iran. And that's why what we are seeing now is a kind of a rapprochement between the United States and Iran in order to prevent the escalation of the Syrian conflict or even a confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
More questions?
Please.
Stella from Business School. When you mention psychological rupture has taken place, and then people are feeling empowered, what do you mean by that?
Simply what I meant by that is that people now realize they can change their plight, they can change their situation, they can challenge authoritarianism, they can topple dictators. In a sentence, they have overcome the wall of fear. The whole idea of the military-industrial complex, the whole idea of the security apparatus. Think of it when they think of Mubarak of Egypt. Mubarak of Egypt had a 1 million man military security apparatus. Torture was routine in Egypt, used to be routine. Anyone who's arrested, tortured, was just literally routine for fun, the police forces. Think of Syria. Think of how massive force that Assad has thrown at the opposition. And think of how many Syrians have been killed, and they continue. Think of what Gaddafi, how brutal he was, regardless of whether you agree with NATO, what NATO did or not. Yet, think Yemen, the same way. So the wall of fear collapsed. People even, and empowerment is a very important question because it's not just about the middle class. What we have seen now, the reason why the turmoil is so real, and the reason why this is a long-term phenomenon, because both the agrarian and the urban poor feels empowered. What we have really seen is the uprising of the poor, the empowerment of the poor, the agency, the role of agency is that individuals now feel that they can really make change. But the reality is, and your question, underlying question is, yes, to what extent can they really provide bread and butter? Can they have employment? Can they really, literally, that's what people now are facing. That 3 years after, people are still cannot really put bread and butter on the table. But you see, so how do you satisfy, how do you meet the aspirations of these millions of people who feel empowered? You can, and that's why at the end of the day, if you think, that if there's a term I want you to think about, particularly when it comes to social sciences, there's a term in political science called contentious politics, unruly politics. That the name of the game in the Middle East for the next 5-10 years will be contentious politics. Contentious politics in the mean that unruly politics, instability, chaos, because you have great expectations and you have millions of young people who basically dream of a better, tomorrow, yet you can never provide them with bread and butter, let alone jobs and, better life. And that's why the rupture I talked about, the empowerment, the local agency has tremendous implications for stability and for the ability of government to deliver. And this is why regardless who comes to power in Egypt, how do you feed? How do you educate? How do you employ 90 million people in a country that does not produce anything. How do you do it? I mean, you need a miracle. Think about it. And that's why, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood or whether it's the military, and remember my words, and I hope I'm wrong, in 2-3 years, the military will discover that they cannot deliver the promises, and you might have, I mean, more and more turmoil in Egypt as a result of the inability of the military to deliver the goods, given the structural, economic, and social crisis in these countries.
You just said that there's some Middle East is below Africa. You have just mentioned that I was not clear.
Youth unemployment, in terms of food insecurity, in terms of even to African continent. I mean, in terms of on these measures, the Arab Middle East, I'm not talking about the oil-producing countries, is below the developmental indicators of Africa itself. Even employment among the youth, in particular, educated youth. This is one of the most, and given also the demography in the region itself, because the largest constituency in the region is below the ages, I mean, you're talking about 60-70%, below the ages of 28 years old. So when you have unemployment, in Tunisia it's 50% unemployment, among 50% in North Africa. This is how bad it is. In Morocco, you know exactly the poverty, the extended poverty in Morocco in particular, in the countryside, in the agrarian side. So this complicates, because poverty, in particular, because the educated youth have different expectations. They are also, even the ones who are semi-educated, they tend, and you know, these are the ages groups which have led the revolutions, the uprisings in every region. But I can send you some, in my book, the one that you mentioned, called The Middle East, there's 3 articles by 3 economists. The first 3 chapters, please take a look at it, in which his name is Professor Kadri, in which has all the data and measures, compares the Middle East to Africa and shows that the Middle East is below Africa in many economic indicators and measures. So the book is by Cambridge University Press, just came out a few weeks ago. It's called The Middle East.
There's a flyer, this kind of flyer is around. I'll take a last question. Yeah, this lady there.
Hello, my name is Maria Princeton. I'm a first-year student in business school. My question is around the large-scale popular uprisings and how other Islamic led countries globally, how are they perceiving what is taking place in the Middle East? For example, Malaysia, where it seems to be working very well for them. How do they perceive what's happening in the Middle East? Does it affect them at all?
Well, I mean, it's an excellent, because I mean, here you have 2 examples where Indonesia and Malaysia are relatively functioning political and economic systems. In fact, Indonesia and Malaysia don't suffer from the same political ills that the Arab Middle East does. And it tells you a great deal about the crisis of governance. We're talking about governance. They did not have the dictators that, of course, Indonesia made the transition in the 1990s, where Malaysia, so it's entirely, and this tells you the reason why your question is, again, not being patronizing. Because when we think, you see, it's very easy for us to look at the Arab Middle East and say, culture, culture, culture. Because some culturalists, this is the easy way out. If you say it's culture, there's no reason to talk about it. You can shut the shop and go home. If it's all about culture, if it's Muslims, Muslim, Muslim, why should we? You see what I'm saying? But, I mean, the indicators, we look at the region in various parts and we realize it's not culture. Turkey is a Muslim nation, ruled by a soft Islamist party, as one of the largest economies in the world. Indonesia is rising very fast. Malaysia is a decent example. It's not there yet, so this tells you about the importance of governance. And we as social scientists, we need to focus on real indicators as opposed to use the word culture and really use it as becomes any explanation that explains everything, explains nothing in a way. And that's what the word culture, because many people say, why are we discussing that part of the world? It doesn't matter, it's all about culture. They will always be who they are because it's something, a rotten gene out there. You see, but it's not. Because your question about Malaysia and Indonesia and other parts of the world shows the ability of these societies to really have good governance and progress accordingly, as opposed to some of the dictatorships that have led their societies dry over the last 30 or 40 years.
It's the last bonus question here.
Student at politics and philosophy. Just wanted to ask you, in terms of political instability, in protest and revolution in the Arab world, which spreads through vast areas. Recently, we've also seen conflicts, Islamist conflicts in Mali, and that could potentially spread to other West African states. How much, in terms of the transition and the process of democracy, do you see this affecting West Africa, or do you even see it affecting the world?
It really is a great deal. I mean, what has happened in Libya is having major impact throughout West Africa and East Africa and North Africa. I mean, Libya now has become, in terms of arms, in terms of, I mean, you have tons of arms, as you know, in terms of money, in terms of training, so major impact. There is no centralized state, there is no security. I mean, you have tens of thousands. I mean, just to give you an idea what I was talking about, just, I mean, take Mali and Somalia and Syria together. In Syria, we estimate that there are between 7,000 and 20,000 extremists who are basically belong to various currents of Al-Qaeda. These are not my numbers. The CIA said 7,000. The numbers here in Britain range between 7,000 and 20,000. You have 2,000 Tunisians, you have 3,000 Libyans, 2,000 Saudis, you have Somalis, you have Pakistanis, Chechens, and this is, and they're all, most of the weapons now are coming from Libya as well, to that part. So, and that's why, I mean, when you have vacuums, when you have vacuum security, and it's easy for these currents to spread and also find space. Al-Qaeda, I mean, the reason why Al-Qaeda is so dangerous, I am one of the people who have never taken Al-Qaeda seriously. Unfortunately, I've been wrong before. But really, I look at this particular nasty organization. This is a golden era for Al-Qaeda now. It's a golden era because this is a great turmoil, great tensions, great vacuum, and it's finding space. I mean, space, you know what I mean by space. It's finding refuge. It's finding ability to basically embed itself in local communities and pretend and that somehow it supports the local communities against their tormentors. And that's what's happening. That's why, I mean, a strong government, centralized government in Libya is so essential for stability in West Africa. That's why, I mean, what's happening in Algeria and Tunisia is very important for stability in Mali as well, and other West African countries. But unfortunately, for the next 5 years or so, Al-Qaeda is bound not only to do a great deal of damage, but to spread further and further. And that's why it's not just about West Africa. I mean, now European governments are terrified of basically the reverberations of the fights in Syria and Iraq and West Africa. We estimate there are about 2,000 Europeans who are fighting in Syria, just in Syria alone. There are between 200 and 700 British young men who are fighting in Syria. We don't know, it's very difficult to, including suicide bombings. Of course, it's very easy to exaggerate the threats, very easy to play on this fear. That's not the question. But it's not just, I mean, even European security agencies are terrified about the potential costs, the potential, because radicalization affects all of us. I mean, you put any one of us in such a situation, and in terms of brain, and in terms of killings, and in terms of violence, and basically mutation happens. Not because wars change people, change societies. And when you have tens of, what happened in Afghanistan between 1980 80s and the implications. And that's why, I mean, what's happening in the region, in the Arab world and in North Africa, really affects security both in West Africa and in Europe itself because of the proximity between Europe and the region.
Fawaz, thank you very much.